In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make this dovetailed box. To begin, I milled up a board of quarter sawn padauk to a 1/2 inch thick and then cut it to 3.5 inches wide at the table saw. Next, using the miter gauge, I cut 2 pieces to 10 inches long and then 2 more pieces to 5 inches long. These parts will make up the box case. Before I begin cutting the dovetails, I like to lay out the pieces and mark their corners with stickers so I don't get them mixed up when I'm cutting the dovetails. Next, I use the marking gauge and scribe a line on all 4 sides of the dovetailed boards. The marking gauge is set to the thickness of the boards, which is a 1/2 inch. For the pin boards, I only mark 2 faces and not the edge. To mark for the dovetails, I use 2 sets of dividers. The first set marks the half pins on the ends of the dovetail board. The second set of dividers is set to 1 full tail plus 1 full pin, so in my case I had it set to 5/8 of an inch. I walk the dividers down the middle of the board, starting with the left leg of the divider in the spot of the half pin on the left side. Then I place the right leg of the divider on the right half pin mark and walk back the other way, marking the layout for the tails. Even though I'm using a dovetail guide to cut the dovetails, I like to mark them with this dovetail marker so I have a better idea of where I need to cut. To cut the dovetails, I'm using the katz-moses magnetic dovetail guide. It holds your saw at the correct angle for the pins and the tails using magnets in the jig. It will also hold your saw at 90 degrees for cutting the half pin. I've used this jig several times and it's a really nice jig. I will leave a link below in the video description so you can go check it out. But a full disclosure, katz-moses Woodworking did send me this jig to try, but I'm a huge fan of it and find it to be a great dovetail jig. To use the jig, I like to put the saw on the line that I'm cutting and then slide the jig up to the saw and let the magnets place the saw in the correct angle. Next, I start sawing down the line and making sure to stop before hitting the scribe line at the bottom that I set with the marking gauge. I continue doing this for the rest of the tails. To remove the half pin, I rotate the dovetail jig to the shoulder side, which is 90 degrees, and start cutting. I stop the cut before I get to the side of the dovetail and pop the piece off. To remove the waste between the tails and the pins, I like to use my bow saw. I like to leave about 1/8 of an inch of waste above the scribe line so that I can then remove using my chisel. Next, I remove the waste in front of the scribe line before placing the chisel directly in the scribe line to prevent the chisel from moving my lines back. I like to chisel down halfway, flip the board over, and then remove the rest of the waste. Next, I transfer the pins to the tailboard by scribing a line using my marking knife. I like to have the tailboard overhang the pin board by about 1/32 of an inch to make it easier to flush up once the box is glued up. And with the pin board clamped to my moxon vise, I rotate the jig to the pin side and begin sawing. I aim to split the marking knife kerf when sawing the tails, but sometimes that's easier said than done. So, if you want to play it safe, you can always saw to the waste side of the line and chisel away any of the waste later on. And again, I use my bow saw to remove the waste between the pins. This time, you will need to pay attention to the angle of the pin walls when removing the waste and angle your saw. Next, I use my chisel to remove the waste. And like before, I angle my chisel to the angle of the pin walls. And just like with the dovetails, I like to chisel down halfway, flip the board over, and then remove the rest of the waste. When test fitting the tailboard, it was a little too tight, so I'll look at the pins for any marks that I made when scribing the tails. I then use my chisel to remove the waste very carefully. And after a few minutes, the dovetails fit nicely. Next, I mark the ends of the outside faces for a stopped groove for the top and the bottom panel. I make a mark 1/8 of an inch on the outside of the scribe line on all 4 corners of each box piece. Over at the rider table, I put an 1/8 inch spiral bit and set the height of it to 1/8 of an inch as well. The fence is also set back 1/8 of an inch. I plunge the piece down on the start line and move it right to left, stopping at the line on the right side of the board. Next, I rotate the board and make the same groove at the top edge of the inside face. Before cutting the box panels, I reassemble it and put clamps on all the corners to pull everything in. With the dimensions, I head over to the table saw and cut the panels to size using my miter gauge. Using the same 1/8 inch bit at the router table, I route a groove on all 4 sides of both the top and the bottom lid so it can sit inside of the grooves cut on the box sides. After cutting the grooves on the panels, I use my shoulder plane to remove some of the waste and make the fit a little bit looser. Next, I sand the inside faces of the box and both faces of the top and the bottom panels with 80, 120, 180, and 220 grit sandpaper to prep them for finish. Before applying the finish, I tape off any of the areas that will be getting glued to prevent any of the shellac from getting on those surfaces. For the finish, I went with the seal coat shellac thin 50-50 with denatured alcohol. I applied 2 coats and then sanded lightly with 220 grit and applied a third and final coat on the inside of the box. This maple is some quilted maple that I've used before, and the shellac is really making this figure pop. It's some really beautiful wood. With the panels pre-finished, I glue up the box. I start by putting glue on all the tails using an acid brush. If I got any of the glue on the inside of the panels, it's not a big deal because we pre-finished them and it wipes right off. Next, I place the panels in the grooves on both the pin boards and place the pin boards in the sockets on the tailboards. And then I tap the joints together with the mallet and I wipe away any of the glue squeeze out with a damp paper towel. After the glue dried, I needed to flatten the bottom of the box, so to do this, I taped some sandpaper to a piece of melamine and rubbed the box back and forth on the sandpaper to flatten the bottom. Next, I used my block plane to flush up the protruding pins and the tails on all corners of the box. After using the block plane, I sanded all 4 sides using my orbital sander. Before cutting the lid loose, I routed an 1/8 inch groove on both panels for the walnut inlay. To help stabilize my router, I attached a long scrap piece of plywood to each face for my router fence to reference. When setting up the router, I made sure to set the bit just inside of the sidewall so that it only removed the maple from the box and not any of the padauk. I set the depth of the bit to a 1/16 of an inch and started removing the waste. Next, I moved the sacrificial fences to the other side of the box and routed away the waste. To cut small pieces of wood for inlay, I started with the scrap piece of walnut that's 1/8 of an inch thick. To make cutting safer, I lower the blade all the way down and place a piece of scrap of wood over the walnut and clamp it into place. Next, I remove the walnut, turn the saw on and raise it until I hear it cutting into the plywood. Now I can safely push the small piece of walnut through the blade without moving around. To install the inlay, I first cut the pieces to the exact length they needed to be and then place them in the groove. Next, I mark the miters using a ruler and a marking knife, aligning it with the corners of the box, and then I remove the waste with the chisel. Next, I add glue to the inlay, place them in the grooves, and then I use an ink roller to make sure that they're properly seated in the groove. After the glue dried, I use my block plane to flush up the inlay that's proud of the surface. With the inlay installed, I can finally cut the lid loose. I set the blade height so that it's roughly a 1/16 of an inch lower than the thickness of the box sides, and then I run the box over the blade. I'll rotate it to cut all 4 sides. That left a small strip of wood that I then removed with my pull saw. To clean up the edges, I first used a block plane and then I ran it over the melamine with the sandpaper taped to it to flatten it out. Next, I installed the hinges. I placed the hinges 2 inches from the edge of the box and scribed a line around them using my marking knife. Next, I used a chisel and a router plane to remove the waste. To mark for the hinges in the lid, I first placed the lid back on the box and transferred the lines using my marking knife. Next, I place the marking knife in the notch and then I scribe a line around the hinge. And again, I remove the waste the same way as before using the chisel and my router plane. Next, I pre-drilled the holes using a self-centering bit and then installed the steel screw provided with the hinges. After cutting the thread with the steel screw, I then installed the brass screws. And finally, I applied the finish to the outside of the box. I ran out of seal coat shellac, so I mixed up a 2-pound cut of de-waxed blonde shellac and applied it using a rag. I applied 2 coats and then sanded with 320 grit and then applied the third and final coat. I will follow this up with a coat of wax. I really love the look of this box with the padauk, quilted maple, and the walnut combinations. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button below and share this with a friend if you think that's something that they would like. And if you're not already, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you can keep up with all of my latest projects. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next build video.